Page 450 continued. A.K. Ramanujan, R. Parthasarathi, and P. Lal. A.K. Ramanujan, a bilingual poet in Kannada-English, was a fellow of Deccan College in 1958-59 and a Fulbright scholar at Indiana University in 1960-62. He worked as lecturer in English at Quilon, Belgaum, and Baroda for 8 years. He served for a number of years as the William E. Colvin, Colvin professor in the Department of South Indian Languages and Civilization and Linguistics at the University of Chicago, USA. Para. Ramanujan, a versatile author, has copiously translated from Tamil and Kannada into English. His translations include 15 Tamil poems, 1965, The Interior Landscape, 1967, for which he was awarded the Gold Medal of Tamil Writers Association, Speaking of Sukha, S-U-K-A, 1974, Samaskara, 1976, and South Indian Folk Tales. He also wrote The Literature of India, an Introduction, 1975, Striders, 1966, Relations, 1971, and Second Sight, 1986, are his 3 collections of poems published in English. He was awarded Padma Shri in 1976 and MacArthur Prize in 1983. Para. Ramanujan, one of the most talented of the new poets, was influenced by the poetry of Wallace Stevens, William Carroll's Williams, E. E. Cummings, Marianne Moore, Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes, and Thomas Gunn. Under the influence of these poets, he became the pioneer of a new kind of poetry, the poetry of self. His poetry is an expression of Indian sensibility, sharpened and nourished by Western education and environment. His success as a poet lies in the fusion of Indian sensibility with his American experiences. He seeks his identity in the mythical and literary past of India. Para. Ramanujan's Indian sensibility finds its superb expression in poems dealing with familial relationships, death and good citizens, small-scale reflections on a great house, love poems for a wife and of mothers, among other things. Para. Ramanujan is a talented poetic craftsman who assiduously polished and refined his poetic style. His language, Ramanujan himself writes, is, quote, intense, creative, imaginative, unquote, stop. K. N. Daruwala writes, quote, Ramanujan's imagination is always focused and never diffuse, stop. His language is razor-sharp, stop. His poetry is both delicate and intricate as the spiral line of a shell, stop. He brings to his poetry an authenticity of experience, but the experience is seized through a perspective of the past, a configuration of familial relationship and his ironic perception, unquote, stop. His poetry is image-oriented. His images are precise, accurate, and highly suggestive in the Striders, the Snakes, Chicago, Zen, Ecology, etc. Para. R. Parthasarathi, the celebrated editor of Poetry from Leeds and 10 20th century poets, is remembered as a poet for his only volume of verse entitled Rough Passage, 1976, which is divided into 3 parts: Exile, Trial, and Homecoming. It has autobiographical interest, page 451. He impresses us as a craftsman. He has written Rough Passage in a 3-line, free verse stanza form that Parthasarathi had developed for himself. He precisely packs his emotions in refined diction and well-chosen images. Para. P. Lal, the pioneer of modern Indian English poetry and the founder of the Writers' Workshop, Kolkata, has helped the Indian English creative writing to have a place of its own in the body of Indian literature. He was awarded Hawthornden, Hawthornden Prize for Poetry in 1958. His poems are contained in The Parrot's Death, Love's First, Change, They Said, Draupadi and Jayadratha, Yakshi from Daidarganj, The Man of Dharma, The Rasa of Silence, Calcutta and Collected Poems. Para. P. Lal is characterized by sharp intellectual quality, clarity of expression, chasteness of diction, spontaneity, suggestiveness, emotional intensity, oftenness, and refinement of diction and evocativeness of images. His favorite themes are love, nature, and man. His poetry ennobles us and refines our feelings. Para. Eminent poets of the 1770s and 80s. Eminent poets of the 70s and 80s. Dom Mores, Mores, won the Hawthornden Prize at Oxford in 1965 for his first collection of poems, A Beginning. His other works include Poems 1960, John Nobody 1965, and Absences 1983. He has also written his autobiography, My Son's Father, a biography of Indira Gandhi, and several travel books. Moraes' poetry has affinities with English romantics and surrealists like Dylan Thomas and George Barker. His poetry is remarkable for lucidity of expression and the use of telling phrases. Para. G.S. Sharat Chandra, born 1938, published 3 collections of poems, April in Nanjugad, Once or Twice, and The Ghost of Meaning. His poetry is immensely personal and reveals his experiences in precise and tense expressions. Para. Grieve, Grieve Patel, who took a degree in medicine, is a medical practitioner in Bombay. He has published 2 collections of poems, Poems 1966 and Do You Withstand Body 1976. Patel is a poet of, quote, promise and potentiality rather than achievement, unquote, stop. His poems show a concern for the deprived section of the society. Body is the central metaphor in Patel's poetry. It is due to the influence of his medical profession on his poetry. Para. Arun Kolatkar, Kolatkar, 1930 to 2004, a graphic artist in Mumbai, is a bilingual poet and writes in Marathi and English. His first long poem, The Boat Ride, is a series of perceptions which is noticeable for economic clarity, precision, irony, correctness, and suggestive images. Choudhury 1976 comprises 30 poems concerned with a visit to Choudhury, a place in Maharashtra famous for the temple of Khandoba. It won for him the Commonwealth Poetry Prize. Kolatkar candidly and picturesquely depicts the reality around him in ironic and detached tone, spiced with touches of sparkling humor. Apparently, Choudhury seems to be a debunking of the ancient religion of India, but in fact it is an ironic statement of the modern man's disbelief in religious rituals. Sarpasatra and Kala Ghoda poems appeared in 2004. The latter work, with a magnificent chain of 31 lyrics collectively called Breakfast Time at Kala Ghoda at its center, is a stunning work. Sarpasutra, a powerful narrative poem, is a skillful and brilliant use of the light-hearted myth of quote, Ojamil and the tigers, unquote, which produces, quote, a dark, ominous parable for our times, about hatred nurtured on memory leading to genocide, unquote, stop. Kolatkar's style is colloquial, laconic, precise and suggestive, semicolon. For example, in Choudhury, the narrator says, quote, scratch a rock and a legend springs, unquote, stop. It suggests that barren land suggests mythology. Para. Adil Jassawala, Jussawala, born 1940, has published 2 volumes of poems, Land's End 1962 and Missing Persons 1976. The poems in the first volume are set against English or European background and are metrical in form. The nursing person reveals the dilemma of an affluent middle-class intellectual who suffers loss of identity and isolation in Europe. Jassawala is a remarkable poetic craftsman who deftly uses English with a freedom and felicity rare in Indian English poetry. Para. K.D. Kotrak, K-O-T-R-A-K, an advertising consultant in Mumbai, has published 3 collections of verse, A Journal of the Way 1969, Diversions by the Wayside 1969, and Underworld 1979. His poems reveal his intense personal experiences and reactions to events in, quote, multi-textured, abstruse, and strange vocabulary, stop, unquote, para. A.K. Mehrotra began his poetical career with Bharat Mata, a long satirical poem on modern India. His full-length collection, 9 Enclosures, written in surrealistic mode, makes virtually no reference to a specific socio-political and even personal background. Page 452. He was influenced by Ezra Pound, Hart Crane, and Wallace Stevens. His poetry is a network of sensory impressions communicated through sharp images. Para. Dilip Chitre's Travelling in a Cage 1980 contains poems which are characterized by black moods, stormy energy, nostalgia, and search for roots. Salim Piradina, Saleem Pwradina, the editor of Contemporary Indian Poetry in English, An Assessment and Selection 1972, composed lyrical, meditative, and ironic poems in First Office 1980. He deals with urban landscape. Vilas Sarang has published his poems in A Kind of Silence 1978, which deal with vacuity and sordidness in modern existence. Santon Rodriguez deals with loveliness, despair, and isolation of the modern man in his poems, which were published in a volume entitled I Exist. C. Raju's poems were published in 2 volumes, The Modern Age and Other Poems 1954 and No Exit 1970. Poems in the first volume are on nature, human life, and classical mythology. Poems in the second volume are introspective and reflective. Debkumar Das, whose poems appeared in Through a Glass Darkly, The Winter Bird Walks, The Eyes of Autumn and the Labyrinths, deal mainly with the exploration of one's self. Keshav, K-I-S-H-A-V, Malik's poems, which are contained in Rifled Shadow 1960 and Storm Warning 1978, articulate the tension man has to undergo in the search of self. K.V.S. Murthy's poems were published in The Allegory of Eternity 1975, The Triple Light 1975, Sparks of the Absolute 1976, Spectrum 1976, and Symphony of Discords 1977. His entire poetry is spiritual and mystical. Para. Rakshat Puri's poems appeared in Poems 1968, 19 Poems 1972, and The Years Like a Fuse 1976. His poems lack in excellence, harmony, and emotional power. Satyadev Jaggi exposes sham and hypocrisy in social behavior in his later poetry. His famous volumes of poetry are A City Within a City, The Only Coming, and Introducing Swami Dhataji, and other poems. Para. S. Santhi, S-A-N-T-H-I, a gifted poetic craftsman whose poems full of sparkling wit and humor. His poems, which were published in Lamplight in the Sun 1967, Whispers Near a Niagara 1969, and Rhyme and Punishment. His accuracy of diction, brevity, and precision of expression add to the pointedness of his wit and humor. Pradeep Sen unites idea, image, and rhythm in And Then the Sun 1960, Poems Old and New 1968, Shankar Mukashi Punekar's poems in the volume. The captive attracted Sir Herbert Reed, who commented, quote, "One day Mr. Mukashi's work will be known through the English-speaking world," unquote, stop. He also translated into English Kalidasa's Ritu Samharam under the title The Cycle of Seasons 1966. Sayyid Amanuddin, a prolific and fertile poet, has published about 10 collections of poems. The Forbidden Fruit 1967, Tiffin State Hospital 1970, Shoes of Tradition 1970, The Children of Hiroshima 1930, Poems of Protest 1972, Lightning and Love 1973, The Age of Female Eunuchs 1974, Adventures of Atman 1977, Gems and Gems 1978, and Poems 1985. Like A.K. Ramanujan, he too is the product of the synthesis between East and West. His poems are distinguished by a variety of themes in humanity and contemporary life, men, women, children, human relationship, mysticism, and spirituality. As a poetic craftsman, Amanuddin possesses, quote, an individual idiom and a distinct voice, unquote, stop. Para. Sayyid Aminuddin, who has 3 collections of poems, What the Himalayas Said and Other Poems 1972, The Dreadful Doom to Come and Other Poems 1974, and A Lover and a Wanderer 1980, is a philosophical and romantic poet with his eyes fixed on a contemporary reality. Para. During this period, 1960 to 80, there have been many poets who have written 1 or 2 volumes of poetry or have contributed to poetry columns in magazines and journals. M. R. Bhagwan's Poems 1964. M.P. Bhaskaran's The Dancer and the Ring, 1962. Shashtibrata's 11 Poems, 1960. M.C. Gabriel's Poems, 1967. Paul Jacobs' Sonnets, 1967. A. Madhavan's Poems, 1967. K. Raghavendra Rao's Poems, 1967. Subhash Saha's Unseen Bird, 1971. And The Ruins of Morning, 1975. And After Midnight, 1981. C. Raju's The Modern Age and Other Poems, 1954, and No Exit, 1970. J.P. Das's Love is a Season, 1978, and Timescapes. Pranab Bandyopadhyay's The Mud Castles, 1976, Call for Freedom, 1976, Whistles in the Wind, 1977, and The Midnight River, 1977. R. Rabindranath Menon's Dasavatara and Other Poems, 1967, Pebbles on the Shore, 1981, Shadows in the Sun, 1976, and 70 Poems, 1971. And Debkumar Das's Through a Glass Darkly, The Winter Bird Walks, The Eyes of Autumn, The Fire Canto, and The Labyrinth deserve mention. Shiva K. Kumar. Shiva K. Kumar has won numerous academic distinctions, was visiting professor of literature at several American universities, page 453. He has been a delegate to Harvard International Seminar, Cultural Award visitor to Australia, British Council visitor at Cambridge, UGC Emeritus Professor at Osmania University, Hyderabad, and consultant creative writing in English at the IGNOU, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in UK in 1978. Para. Kumar has published 5 volumes of poetry: Articulate Silences, 1970, Cobwebs in the Sun, 1974, Subterfuges, 1976, Woodpeckers, 1979, and Trapped Fallows in the Sky, 1986. He is an academic poet. His poetry bears the stamp of his learning and scholarship. He writes on a variety of subjects, but he is known as a poet of love and sex, poised against traditional religion and morality. What distinguishes Kumar's poetry is the dichotomy between intuition over reason, between head and heart. His poetry also deals with the predicament of man, modernity and tradition, East and West. Irony is Kumar's forte. His poetry is terse and hard-edged. He employs, quote, chiseled and finely nuanced diction, unquote, to examine the paradoxes and anomalies of modern life. K. N. Daruwala, para. K. N. Daruwala, a widely published and anthologized poet, has published about 6 collections of poems. Under Orion, 1970, Apparition in Orion, 1971, Crossing of Rivers, 1976, Winter Poems, 1980, The Keeper of the Dead, 1982, and Landscapes, 1987. He was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Award for The Keeper of the Dead in 1984. He stands out among English poets for bringing to poetry a range of experience generally outside the ambit of poets. His experience as a police officer has dearly helped him in this. He depicts vividly and minutely the contemporary Indian socio-political world with touches of irony and sarcasm. He exposes the evils of communal tension, riots, exploitation, greed, criminalization of politics, dowry, etc. His poetry is suffused with varied aspects of Indian sensibility. His landscape is essentially Indian, especially North Indian. The background of his poetry is provided by his immediate surroundings: Ganga, Ghagra, Chambal Valley, Tarai, Varanasi, Hardwar, Rishikesh, and Badrinath. Love, sex, and marital relationship occupy a predominant place in his poetry. Para. Daruvala is a skilled poetic craftsman. His efforts to domesticate English are admirable. He freely uses words which are indicative of rituals and religious aspects of Hindus, such as mantra, Gayatri, Pinddan, Panchtirtha, Ashram, Ardhakumbh, etc. He also uses Muslim myths and rituals in Ag Matam, 6th Muharram in Lucknow, and the mazars of Amroha. In the Parsi Hill, he has used Parsi myth. Daruvala thus represents the cultural and religious plurality of secular India. Daruvala, a gifted poetic artist, has cultivated a modern idiom. His style is colloquial and ironical when he exposes social evils. His images are there, tanned and suggestive. Ezekiel writes, quote, by depth of feeling, economy of language and originality of insight, Daruvala commands respect, unquote, stop. Jayant Mahapatra, para. Jayant Mahapatra, a prolific poet, is a late bloomer in the field of poetry. Formerly a professor of physics in Ravenshaw College, Cuttack, he began writing poetry at the age of 40. In 1968, he has so far published Close the Sky, 10 by 10, 1971, Swayamvara and Other Poems, 1971, Countermeasures, 1973, A Father's Hours, 1976, A Reign of Rites, RITES, 1974, Waiting, 1979, The False Start, 1988, Life Science, 1983, Dispossessed Nests, 1986, Selected Poems, 1987, Burden of Waves and Fruits, 1988, Temple, 1989, and The Whiteness of Bones, 1992. He was awarded the Jacob Glastein, Glastein Memorial Prize, Chicago, in 1975, the second prize at the poetry contest held by the International Who's Who in 1970, and the Sahitya Academy Award in 1981. He represented India at the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, USA in 1976. Para. Mahapatra is an original poet. No poet influenced him. His poetic sensibility is typically Indian. He is intensely aware of his environment and vividly portrays the variegated Orissa landscape throbbing with religious fervor. Orissa landscape with Puri and Konarak looming large has a dominant presence in his poetry. The physical landscape represents the deeper levels of Indian consciousness and psyche, which have been shaped by religious and cultural forces coming down to the present from the hoary days of the Vedas. The Orissa landscape has been vividly depicted at dawn at Puri, listening to a prayer, Indian summer, thought of the future, Konarak, Orissa landscape, the ruins, etc. Para. Mahapatra poetry is unsentimental, but it is remarkable for depth of feeling and true imagination, which embraces a wide variety of themes. Orissa landscape, page 454. rootlessness and emptiness in modern existence, love, sex, and relationships. His poetry is always earnestly unpretentious and powerful. Mahapatra demonstrates, quote, a deep aesthetic concern for both structure as well as linguistic versatility, for revealing maturity and originality of a remarkable high order. Unquote, stop. His symbol and images are evocative and suggestive. His poetry is restrained and balanced. In his latest collection of poems, The Dispossessed Nests, he effectively deals with subjects like Punjab turmoil and Bhopal gas tragedy. O.P. Bhatnagar, para. O.P. Bhatnagar, a celebrated poet, has published his poems in 6 volumes. Thought Poems, 1976, Feeling Fossils, 1977, Angels of Retreat, 1979, Oneiric, O-N-E-I-R-I-C Vision, 1980, Shadows in Floodlights, 1984, and The Audible Landscape, 1986. He has evolved a theme-oriented technique. He expresses with touches of gentle irony and satire the helplessness and hopelessness of man coiled in the midst of socio-political problems. Bhatnagar is a humanist who sympathizes with the poor and the exploited. He also writes about love and sex. His views on sex are radical. Sex is a biological necessity and it has to be satiated and enjoyed. Bhatnagar's method of communication is gentle irony and satire. He uses highly suggestive metaphors, similes, and symbols to articulate his visions. For example, how long shall we argue / our life into rustic logic? Like envelopes pasted, with cancelled stamp, Para. Bhatnagar has evolved a fresh idiom to communicate his experiences by using a mix of Indian and foreign myths and metaphors. Para. I.H. Rizvi, R-I-Z-V-I, who began composing poetry in mid-80s with the publication of Unfading Blooms, 1984, and Thirsty Fables, 1986, published his best and mature poetry in the 90s of the 20th century. Rizvi's 2 volumes of poetry, Snowflakes of Dreams, 1996, and Fettered Birds, 2002, contain his poems which show poetic maturity. He has also edited Contemporary Indian English Love Poetry, 1990. Rizvi, an original poet, follows no poetic model, no pattern. His originality of approach, vivid communication of ideas and feelings, apt and suggestive diction, concrete images, sensuousness and picturesqueness, flight of imagination wedded to the hard facts of life, and use of myth lend an extraordinary charm to his poems on human predicament in modern age. He has also composed poems on nature, love, and sex. Para. Baldev Mirza, in 1932, the famous editor of Skylark, has published 3 volumes of poetry, and his latest poems have appeared in various journals and magazines. Words on Fire, 1981, Shall I Speak Out, and Buddha My Love, 1985, contain his poems. Mirza's poetry is truly Indian, both in theme and the adroit use of Indian English. Para. I.K. Sharma, an academic poet, has revealed great artistic skill and ability to use English in his poems, which have been published in Shifting Sand Dunes and The Native Embers. R.K. Singh collected his poems in My Silence and Memories Unmemoried, UNMEMORIED. His poems are regularly appearing in Canopy, Creative Forum. The poet and many other journals and magazines, to him poetry is a personal and subjective. Singh is an academic and urban poet. Narsingh Srivastava, who has published The Dance of Shiva and Laila Majnu and other poems, is an academic poet whose poetry lacks in lucidity and clarity, which characterize good poetry. Prakash Joshi's two collections of poems, Scattered Thoughts and Blooming Buds, reveal his social concerns. He ruthlessly exposes the hollowness of modern man through evocative images and symbols. Nardeo Sharma, an urban poet, writes about the hard realities of life in Melody of Wounds. M. A. Nare, N-A-R-E, in his poems, collected in Visions and Voices, expresses his own impressions, experiences, and observations of varied manifestations of life. Para. Indian English poetry from 1990 to 2005. Indian English poetry has been enriched by a large number of new poets. The poets of the 70s and 80s like K.N. Daruwala, Jayant Mahapatra, M.N. Sharma, I.H. Rizvi, and many others are brilliantly writing. Some of the works of A.K. Ramanujan, uncollected poems, The Black Hen, The Interior Landscape, Speaking of Shiva, and Hymns for the Drowning, have been published. The Oxford India Ramanujan, OOP 2004, edited by Molly Daniels, Ramanujan with an introduction by Vinay Dharwarkar, is a worth mentioning book. I.H. Rizvi's anthology entitled Contemporary Indian English Poetry 1988 acquaints us with new voices in Indian poetry who made significant contribution to contemporary Indian English poetry. R. Rangarao, Niranjan Mohanty, A.C. Tripathi, O.P. Arora, P.K. Joy, Forhat Amin, P.K. Padhi, S.R. Tambe, S.C. Divedi, Tabish Khayar, T.V. Reddy, Y.N. Vaish, Mahasweta Chaturvedi, and many others are the new poets of promise. Page 455, para. H. G. Rasool's collection of poems, Mallanji Henna, Henna Leaves, 2000, is about the customs, rituals, relationships, sharing and experiencing of Muslims in the south, especially Kanyakumari district. T.P. Rajivan's He Who Was Gone Thus, 2004, is a collection of poems which are suffused with animals and wheat. Quote, his metaphors are energetic without being pretentious. Stop. Unquote. R.M.P. Shastri's Self, an anthology of poems, 2001, contains philosophical, mystical, and spiritual poems which show the influence of Advaita thought. C.L. Khatri's Ripples in the Lake, 2006, contains 64 poems on a variety of themes. His symbols and images are suggestive and concrete. Khatri's first collection of poems, entitled Kargil, is, quote, an anthology of 43 poems, mostly of free verse, ranging between a national spirit and the international acumen, unquote. Stop. A Thirsty Cloud Cries, 2006, by a new poet, S.K. Arora, quote, Ishitva, Ishwttiva, unquote. A collection of poems on a variety of themes is conspicuous for spontaneity, lucidity, and clarity of expression. Para. Indian English poetry has come of age and its future is immense. Section Women Poets, para. The emergence of a large number of women poets is a significant feature of post-independence poetry. Kamala Das, Gauri Deshpande, Mamta Kalia, Monica Varma, Margaret Chatterjee, Anna Sujata Mathai, Sunita Jain, etc. communicate a powerful female sensibility which does not find expression in their male counterparts. Lakshmi Kanans, a practicing poet, points out that, quote, poetry by women continues to be fresh and inventive, unquote, stop, para. Kamala Das, a bilingual writer in English and Malayalam, has distinguished herself as an Indian English poet. Her well-known poetry collections are Summer in Calcutta 1965, The Descendants 1967, The Old Playhouse and Other Poems 1973, and Collected Poems 1985. She won Kerala Sahitya Academy Award for Fiction in 1969, the Chimanlal Award for Fearless Journalism in 1971, World Prize for Literature in 1984, and the Sahitya Academy Award for Collected Poems in 1985. Para. The tone of Das's poetry is distinctively feminine. She is preeminently a poet of love, sex, lust, pain, nervousness, melancholy, and frustration. She is a confessional and autobiographical poet who writes about her own experiences of frustration in love and drudgery in married life. In one of her best poems, Summer in Calcutta, she frankly writes about her first sexual encounter with man. All her famous poems, The Testing of Sirens, My Grandfather's House, The Descendants, The Looking Glass, etc., are personal and autobiographical. She expresses her deep anguish over the loss of female identity in the presence of domineering male. She craves for liberty. Para. In The Old Playhouse and Other Poems, she boldly and frankly reveals tension in man-woman relationship, the inadequacy of love, and intolerable sexual tyranny and subjugation. She yearns for liberation. With growing maturity, Kamala Das develops a detached outlook and turns to the interior landscape of the soul, as in the famous poem Radha. It is her frustration in love and subsequent feelings of melancholy and yearning for a detached existence which propelled her to compose poems. Para. In Collected Poems, Das makes a significant change in her themes and technique. She emerges out of the narcissistic world of the self and recognizes the reality of suffering in the outer world. Symbols and images assume a wider and more concrete significance. Para. Kamala Das's quote, world is intensely feminine and her idiom, refreshing Indian, unquote, stop. Her poetry is remarkable for immaculate and flawless command over English. Her poetic style concretizes her emotions with remarkable ease and clarity. Para. Monica Varma has 6 volumes of poetry to her credit. Dragonflies Draw Flame, 1962. Gita Govinda and Other Poems, 1966. Green Leaves and Gold, 1970. Quartered Questions and Queries, 1971. Past Imperative, 1970. Across the Vast Spaces, 1975. And Alaknanda, 1976. Our poetry is not confined to love, lust, and sex. It embraces, quote, an enormous arc of experience, unquote, stop. Varma's poetry is conspicuous for social awareness, vivid descriptions of nature, and the sincere presentation of the emotion of love. She has evolved a style, imagery, idiom, and tone which articulate her typical Indian experience. Para. Gauri Deshpande, a celebrated poet, has published 3 collections of her poems, Between Births, Lost Love, 1970, and Beyond the Slaughter House, 1972. Beyond the Slaughterhouse, 1972, page 456. She writes about love, marital relationship, and nature's changing moods. She is endowed with a unique knack of making poetry out of the commonplace, as in A Change of Seasons, migraine, thinking disgustedly, etc. Deshpande is at her best when she expresses feminine sensibility. Para. Mamta Kalia, a bilingual poet in Hindi and English, has 2 volumes of poems in English. Tribute to Papa and Other Poems, 1970, and Poems, 1979, to her credit. Her poems on love, marriage, family life, and society are noticeable for freshness, irony, wit, satire, and sharp intellectual quality. She also imparts autobiographical flavor to her poetry. Her language is frank, straightforward, and ironical. Para. Sunita Namjoshi's poems, 1967, Cyclone in Pakistan, 1971, More Poems, 1971, and Jackass and the Lady, 1989, contain poems about society, life, and love in rhythmical, precise, restrained, balanced, and lyrical style. Eunice D'Souza, born 1940, whose poems have appeared in a number of magazines and anthologies, explores, quote, the Goan Catholic milieu clinically, the insider-turned-outsider who probes the foibles, attitudes, and complexes of the community. She writes in an easy, effortless, direct, simple, and ironical manner. Lakshmi Kanan's poems In the Glow and the Grey and Impressions are haunting, melodious lyrics on self-exploration, love and contemporary reality. Roshan Alkazi's poems in 17 Poems 1965 and 17 More Poems 1970 are harmoniously and lucidly written lyrics on loveliness, beggars, alienation, flesh and body, and the predicament of modern man. Sunita Jain, in her poems, which appeared in Man of Desires 1978, Between You and God 1979, and Beneath the Frost, sings of the varied moods and shades of love, joy, and separation, romance and reality, passion and love, youthful gaiety and harshness, which often develop with years. She has beautifully created the twilight world of dream and nostalgia in her lyrics. Leela Roy, a talented and prolific poet, has published Entrance Poems 1961, The Valley of Vision, and The Flowering Heart. She is the most emotionally rich and controlled in her technique, recreating the felt emotions in poetry. A.S. Modail, Modayil, has written on the predicament of women in her poems, which have been collected in Crucifixions 1973 and We the Unreconciled 1972. In her 3 collections of poems, Weeping Seasons 1971, Voodoo 1972, and Staircase 1973, Gauri Pant writes about her reveries, past memories, pain, anguish, love, and search for identity in a readable, musical, and lyrical style. Lalitha Venkateshwaran writes about love and man-woman relationship in her poems, quote, collected in Declarations 1970, Rocking Horse 1973, and Tree Bird 1975. Her poetry is remarkable for vivid images and startling symbols. No unquote sign. Para. Meena, Meena Alexander has composed beautiful poems on melancholy, death, devaluation of values in life. In her poetry published in The Bird's Bright Ring 1976, Without Place 1978, and I Root My Name 1977. In her first volume, she carefully employs the stream of consciousness technique and the dramatic monologue technique. Her perfect and immaculate command over language, picturesque and suggestive images, clear and highly expressive words, and spontaneity are the outstanding characteristics of her poetry. Drops in Rain 1984, a collection of 39 poems by Nirupama Narasimhan, is remarkable for thematic variety and concrete images and symbols. Para. Other memorable works by women poets are Chitra Prasad's The Raging Moon 1972, Rohini Gupta's Karma and Other Poems and 5 Farces, Dorothy Sinha's Facets 1976, Leela Dharmaraj's Slum, Silhouettes and Other Poems, Ira Dey's The Hunt and Other Poems, Tapti Mukherjee's The Golden Road to Samarkand, Tilottama Rajan's Myth in a Metal Mirror, Rita Dalmier's In Aloneness, Renu Roy's On Your Window Sill, Zahida Zaidi's Broken Mirror, and Benny and Words, Uma Parmeshwaran's Cyclic Hope, Cyclic Pain, Malati Roy's Khajuraho and Other Poems 1976, and Vimala Rao's Banaras and Poems. Para. Harinder Ray Singh's Reflections 1990 is a collection of poems which, quote, start with personal revelations and go deeper into the feelings of dreamy world where only unhappiness and throbs of life encounter her, unquote, stop. Shanta Acharya's Looking In, Looking Out 2006 is a collection of poems on a wide variety of topics.